The wind had a bite to it that day, dry, sharp, and full of dust. Out on the edge of the Colorado Territory, 1871, a crumbling trading post leaned against the horizon like it had given up waiting for company. Its sign creaked on rusted hinges, the porch sagged, and sagebrush curled dead at its base. James Rowe sat slumped under the awning. One boot stretched the other, tucked beneath him. Blood had soaked through the shoulder of his flannel shirt, the makeshift bandage long since useless. Dust clung to his beard, to the creases around his eyes, to the rim of his sweat-darkened hat. He hadn't eaten in days, hadn't spoken to another soul in longer, hadn't prayed since Missouri. Then footsteps, not boots, not hooves, just a soft crunch on the dirt. His fingers twitched toward his revolver, then stopped. Too light, too quiet. He raised his head slowly. A girl stood a few feet away. No older than 4 barefoot, wrapped in a tattered shawl. Her cheeks were smudged with dirt hair, tangled, but her dark eyes were clear and steady. She looked at him not with fear, but with something closer to recognition. "You look tired, mister," she said, voice small but sure. "Want to meet my ma?" James blinked. His body ached, his mind fogged, but her presence cut through it. She waited, hands clasped like she'd been taught how to speak to grown-ups. He should have said no. Should have turned away, disappeared into the woods, into the dark. But something in her eyes, steadfast and soft, made him pause. He lifted 2 fingers to the brim of his hat. "I reckon I might." The girl smiled just a little, as if she knew he would. "Come on," she said, turning. James pushed himself up, teeth clenched as pain tore through his shoulder. He spat dust, then followed her behind the trading post and into the tall grass. The sun dipped low behind them, the sky bleeding into orange and violet. He didn't ask her name. She didn't ask his. They just walked. Half a mile later, they crested a low hill. Nestled below was a house barely more than a burrow built from clay and fieldstone roofed with sun-dried wood and sod. Smoke drifted lazily from a stubby chimney. Chickens scratched in the dirt, and a single cornstalk leaned beside the door. "That's home," the girl said. "You can sit on the stool, but don't bleed on Ma's chopping log. She gets real mad." James coughed a dry chuckle. "I'll keep that in mind." They reached the house as the sun slipped beneath the ridge. The girl cupped her hands and called out, "Ma, I brought somebody." A moment passed, then the door opened. A woman stepped out. Bare-armed hair tied back with a strip of linen. Her face looked young, but her eyes, dark tired, still had seen too much. She didn't look surprised, just wary. "We don't bring home wounded animals," she said flatly. "He's not an animal," the girl replied. "He's just tired." James tried to speak, but staggered instead. His knee hit the dirt. A groan escaped his throat. "Please, Ma," the girl whispered. "He's hurt real bad." The woman's eyes stayed fixed on James. He forced himself upright. "I can go," he said hoarsely. "Didn't mean trouble." "You already have," she answered, not moving. The girl reached for her mother's skirt. "You always say folks need help even if they don't deserve it. You said that when we found the raccoon in the well." A beat passed. Then the woman sighed hard. "Inside is for family," she said. "He sleeps in the granary." "He won't mind," the girl replied. "He's quiet, like our mule." The woman turned to James. "Can you walk?" He nodded once. She disappeared into the house. The girl, still nameless, took his hand and led him around the side of the house. The granary was cool and dark, the scent of grain and earth thick in the air. "That's where Ma naps when her head hurts," the girl said, pointing to a cot. "You can use it." James collapsed onto the straw bedding with a groan. Minutes later, the woman returned with a basin cloth and a bottle. "I'll clean it," she said. "You scream, I stop." He gave a tired nod. She peeled back the bandage, poured the clear liquid it burned like fire, then pressed the cloth down. James gritted his teeth, eyes shut. After a long silence, she stood. "It'll scar," she said, "but it won't rot." "Thank you," he rasped. She didn't reply, just left. The girl peeked in behind her, waved once, and vanished. James stared at the rafters overhead, and for the first time in months, he slept. The next morning, James woke to the sound of water dripping through a crack in the granary roof. His shoulder throbbed, his shirt clung damp to his skin, and the straw beneath him was soaked where rain had gathered overnight. He sat up slowly, groaning as every muscle in his body reminded him he hadn't healed yet. The light that filtered in through the wall slats was dull and gray, and the air had that heavy, clean scent of a storm past. He pulled on his coat, stiff with dried blood and dew, and stepped out into the yard. No one called to him. No one told him to stop. So he walked to the shed, found a bent nail and a crooked board, and patched the worst part of the roof. The pain in his shoulder flared with each movement, but the act of doing a fixing quieted something in him. By late morning, the sun peeked through. James found an old hoe and started clearing weeds near the well. The ground was packed hard, the roots stubborn, but he didn't stop. He didn't need to be told what to do. He just did it. That was when she appeared again, Ella, the barefoot girl with the dust-smudged face. She carried a tin cup of water and half a boiled potato wrapped in a handkerchief. "You fix a lot," she said simply, sitting on the fence he had repaired just hours ago. James wiped sweat from his forehead. "Broke a lot, too," he said, trying to even it out. She smiled, swinging her legs. "Mama says you still look like a stray dog." James chuckled softly. "I probably do." They sat in silence, the kind that wasn't uncomfortable, just still. Then a voice came from the house. "Ella, inside." "Coming," she called, hopping off the fence. Before she left, she handed James the potato. He took it unsure whether to laugh or cry. Later that evening, James sat by the fire pit, the twilight stretching long and soft over the prairie. He hummed a tune under his breath, an old folk song from back in Kentucky. He didn't realize how loud he'd gotten until he heard the back door creak. He didn't turn, but he knew she was there. Rachel. She stood just inside the kitchen, listening. Her hands were wet, the dish she'd been washing forgotten. The song, the way he sang it, had cracked something inside her chest. Her husband used to hum that same tune back when life was hard but hopeful. Before the raids, before the fever, before the silence. She stepped away from the window before he saw her. But later that night, she returned quietly, holding a folded wool blanket. She didn't speak. She didn't ask permission. She just placed it beside him in the granary and turned to leave. James looked up from his cot. "Thank you," he said softly. She didn't respond, just paused for a breath, then left him there. He pulled the blanket over his shoulders and sank into the straw. And for the second night in a row, he slept. Real sleep. The kind where the mind stops running and the body forgets pain. By the end of the week, something had shifted. Rachel no longer looked at him like a problem. She didn't exactly look at him like family either, but the suspicion had faded into something more cautious, maybe even curious. She asked questions, clipped ones. "Where are you from?" "Ozark Edge," he answered. "Before the war. Raised hogs, built fences, carved toys for my nephew." She didn't press further. Not yet. But that night, after Ella had gone to sleep, Rachel stepped outside where James was mending the edge of a broken bench. She sat down across the fire pit from him. The flames crackled. The stars blinked awake. Then James spoke, slow, quiet, but certain. "I was Union Army, enlisted out of Jefferson City, infantry." Rachel stayed still. Shiloh. Stones River. Then west he continued. They sent us to clear rebel sympathizer camps. Said they were threats. Some were just families. Some weren't even that." His voice cracked. "I stood in front of a woman once. Told my captain he'd have to shoot me first." "Did he?" she asked. "No, they just shot around me." The fire popped. "My husband died in a camp like that," she said. "He was Cherokee. They said he was trespassing. Starved him with fever in a tent." James's eyes fell. "I'm sorry." "Sorry doesn't matter," she said, rising. She turned to go, then stopped. Her shoulders shook, not with anger, but with something deeper. "You think a lullaby and a mended fence make up for it?" she snapped. James stood slowly. "No, ma'am, I don't." "Then why are you here?" He looked at her, no lies in his eyes. "Because I can't run any more. And this is the first place that's made me want to stop." Rachel stared at him, eyes sharp, fists tight. Then, suddenly, her hand slammed down on the side table by the fire. A clay mug shattered on the ground. "Get out," she whispered. James didn't argue. He bent down, picked up his hat, and walked toward the darkness. He didn't take the blanket. Didn't look back at the house. Didn't glance at the window where Ella slept. He just walked into the wind and the cold. And behind him, Rachel stood alone in the flicker of firelight, breathing hard, her heart pounding for reasons she didn't fully understand. Snow came sooner than it should have. By morning, the sky turned to ash, heavy with something ancient and relentless. Rachel felt it deep in her chest as she stood on the porch, arms crossed, breath curling in the air. The wind was sharp and quick, and even the mule in the shed had gone quiet. She turned to call for Ella. No answer. "Ella!" she shouted again, louder this time. Silence. Panic rose in her throat. She rushed inside, checked under the bed, the loft behind the stove. No boots, no shawl. The door still cracked open from earlier. Her heart dropped. Rachel ran back outside. The wind howled like a scream. Then she saw them small footprints in the snow trailing off past the garden fence, heading east. God, no. She took off running. She slipped once near the chicken coop, but caught herself. The prints were already filling in snow, swirling fast. "Ella!" she screamed. Her voice tore in the wind. A dark figure appeared over the ridge. Horse hooves thundered through the storm. James. He dismounted the moment he saw her, his face raw from the cold. "Where is she?" he yelled. "She went toward the ravine. I lost the trail." Rachel sobbed, eyes wild. James didn't waste a breath. He turned back, mounted fast. "You can't see anything out there," she shouted after him. He looked over his shoulder. "You think I came back to let her die?" Then he disappeared into the white. Rachel dropped to her knees, snow collecting on her back, her fists clenched in the dirt under the powder. The only warmth she had left was the imprint of his last words. James pushed through knee-deep snowcoat, flapping like a torn flag. He scanned the stream bed, stopped at every hollow tree and thicket, dismounting, checking, calling her name. Then a flash of blue. Her shawl snagged on a branch. He found her, curled beneath it, small, and still her lips-tinged blue eyes half shut. "Ella." She didn't speak, but her chest rose barely. He wrapped her in his coat, held her against him, and turned back. No time to mount. He cradled her close, dragged the mule behind them, feet dragging through the drifts. His old wound screamed. His legs buckled more than once. But he never stopped. "Stay with me," he whispered. "I got you." From the porch, Rachel saw them crest the hill, James swaying, Ella limp in his arms. She ran, grabbed the child first, wrapped her in her arms. "She's breathing," she gasped. Then James collapsed into the snow. Rachel cried out, dropped beside him. His face was pale. His lips cracked, but when she pressed her ear to his chest, there. A heartbeat, faint but there. "Don't you dare," she whispered fiercely. "You don't save her and leave me with your ghost." His eyes cracked open just enough to see her. "Couldn't leave her," he mumbled. Then he passed out again. Inside, Rachel worked with shaking hands. She laid Ella by the hearth, stripped her damp clothes, layered her in wool and warmth. She wrapped heated bricks and boiled water for James, dried his hair, held his hand when he moaned in fever. For 3 days she didn't sleep. She whispered prayers she hadn't dared say since before the war. She held his hand through the fever. She sang to her daughter as she slept, then to the unconscious man in the granary. On the 4th morning, James opened his eyes. Rachel was beside him, wiping sweat from his brow. "You're still here," he rasped. "You think I'd let you die in my barn?" she muttered. "You let me freeze out there first." She gave a dry smile. "Consider us even." He tried to laugh, but it turned into a cough. "Ella, she's safe," Rachel said. "Thanks to you." He shut his eyes again, letting that truth settle in. That evening, Ella sat on his cot with a bowl of broth. She offered him a carved stick figure she'd made. "It's supposed to be you," she said shyly. "It's got too much hair," he whispered. She giggled. Mama said the same. Rachel watched them from the doorway, arms crossed. Her mouth didn't smile, but her eyes had softened. James didn't say thank you. She didn't say welcome. But it didn't matter. Something had changed. Something had stayed. James recovered slowly, like the land outside, still cold in the mornings, but with signs of thaw. The snow melted in uneven patches across the field. The chickens returned to pecking at the dirt. Rachel started hanging laundry again. Her sleeves rolled up her eyes, scanning the hills as if they might try to steal something else from her. James stayed in the granary at first, then moved to the porch during the day, sitting in the sun, carving little wooden animals from scraps he found in the barn. A fox for Ella, then a bird, then a small misshapen pony that made her laugh out loud. Rachel never commented, but she didn't stop him either. She began to ask questions, not many and not soft, but they came. "What did you do before?" "Hogs, fences. I used to carve toys for my sister's boy," James answered. "Back in Missouri." She nodded, said nothing for a while. Then, as if trying not to ask, said, "During." James's jaw shifted. "I enlisted early. Union Army, infantry. 61. He stared at the wood in his hands. "Shiloh, Stones River, then Kansas, Colorado. They called it clearing out sympathizers. Sometimes they were families. Sometimes just camps with nothing left but kids." Rachel's lips pressed tight. He looked up. "I tried to stop one. Once. Rode into a village, told them not to do it. Captain said they were hiding rebels. Were they?" James shook his head. "They were hiding grain." The fire between them crackled. Rachel's hands balled at her sides. "My husband died in one of those camps." James didn't move. He was Cherokee. They said he was trespassing on his own land. Her voice dropped. "They let him die. Fever, no water, 2 weeks." "I'm sorry," James said quietly. She looked at him, anger flashing. "You think that matters?" "No," he answered, "but I needed to say it." She stepped forward, eyes hard. "You think a carved fox and a patched fence fix anything?" "No, ma'am," James said steady. "They don't fix the past, but they mean I'm still trying." Rachel turned to leave, then stopped. Her voice trembled. "Why are you still here?" He took a breath. "Because I can't keep running. And this is the first place that felt like it might let me stand still." She stared at him. Then, without a word, she slammed her hand against the side of the porch. A tin cup rattled and fell. "Get inside before the wind kicks up again," she muttered. He didn't ask what she meant. He just followed. That night, Rachel brought a bowl of stew to the porch where James sat mending a splintered handle. She handed it to him. "Eat it now. I'm not warming it later." "Yes, ma'am." She sat down beside him, not touching, not speaking. But she didn't leave. Later, when Ella was asleep and the moonlight stretched across the fields, Rachel walked out with something bundled in cloth. She held it out to James. He opened it slowly, a braided leather bracelet, faded, a silver bead in the middle. He made it for her when she was born, she said. Said it would keep her safe. James stared at it. You sure? Keep it for her, she said, until she's old enough to know what it means when someone chooses to stay. James swallowed hard. He took the bracelet in both hands. Thank you, he whispered. Rachel turned and walked back toward the house. Not fast, not away, just toward something new, and James sat in the quiet, the bracelet warm in his palm, and for the first time in years he didn't feel like a man holding borrowed time. He felt like he belonged. Spring had come, but not gently. The storms had passed weeks ago, yet the wind still carried a bite, and the memories of snow clung to the corners of the house like cobwebs. Rachel had opened every window to let the stale winter air escape, but it still lingered like silence, like grief. James moved slowly at first. The fever had broken, but the weakness hadn't. His steps were uncertain, his shoulders stiff, but every day he went a little farther from the granary to the porch, from the porch to the woodpile, then finally out past the garden fence. He never asked what needed doing. He just noticed. He hammered in a loose hinge on the barn door, patched the gate Ella had nearly splintered with her pony, and started reinforcing the southern fence line without a word. He moved like someone who didn't expect thanks, just someone who knew what it meant for things to fall apart and who quietly wanted to keep that from happening again. Rachel watched him from the porch. She didn't offer help, didn't praise him, but she didn't tell him to stop either. That was something. Ella followed close behind, skipping along the rows of weeds James pulled from the corn patch. She asked questions without end. What do worms eat? Why do some clouds look angry? How did he get the scar on his hand? James answered what he could, evaded what he couldn't, and smiled more than he realized. One afternoon, he carved her a pony saddle, stitched with uneven but careful hands, using scraps of worn leather shaped to fit the little mare she adored. He didn't tell anyone he was doing it. Just left it by the porch one morning with her name burned into the side. Ella squealed when she found it and galloped across the yard like a windstorm with braids. That was the first time Rachel smiled at him. Not a big smile, not wide, but real. Later that day, she came down to where he sat sharpening a hoe by the cottonwood tree. The wind was calm. The smell of tilled soil and sun-warmed pine drifted on the air. You carved that saddle by hand, she asked, her arms folded. James nodded. Didn't have much else to do when I couldn't lift a shovel. It's good work, she said. Then added more quietly, she won't forget that. I hope not, he replied. She reminds me what I want to be. Rachel tilted her head. What's that? He set the tool down, wiped his palms. Better than I was. They fell into silence. But it wasn't tense anymore, just settled. Rachel glanced toward the horizon where the sky blushed gold with early sunset. You know, she said, her voice distant, I stayed here after he died because I didn't know what else to do. I had a baby, a plot of land, a roof that barely held together. She paused, and part of me thought, maybe if I waited long enough something would come back. Maybe not him, but something. James didn't speak. Then she reached into her apron and pulled out a small bundle of cloth. She held it for a moment before unfolding it. Inside was a bracelet, braided leather, worn thin at the edges, with a dull silver bead at its center. He made this for her when she was born, she said. Said it would protect her. James looked down at it. Why give it to me? Rachel exhaled slowly. Because I've spent too many years burying things. My voice, my grief, my hope. I was going to bury this too with his name." She met James's eyes steady and unflinching. "But I don't want to bury anything else. Not if I don't have to." He reached out careful and took the bracelet. "I'll keep it for her," he said, "until she understands." Rachel nodded. Understands what? What it means to be loved by someone who chooses to stay. The wind stirred again, soft this time. The air smelled of lilac and earth. That night, Ella curled up beside James on the porch bench, wrapped in a quilt too big for her. Her pony, grazed by the fence fireflies, blinked in the tall grass, and James hummed a tune low in his throat, just enough for her to drift off. Rachel sat nearby her knitting, untouched on her lap. The sound of his voice settled into her chest like the first deep breath after a storm. She hadn't meant to watch him this long, hadn't meant to hope, but now she didn't want him to leave. She didn't want to carry the weight alone anymore. Still, she said nothing. Not yet. The next day, James was up before the sun. He pulled water from the well, fed the chickens, and returned to work on the fence. Sweat streaked his neck by midday. Ella brought him cold water in a dented tin cup, grinning as she watched him drive another post into the dirt. "You think the fence'll stay up forever?" she asked. James glanced at her. "Nothing stays up forever. Then why fix it?" He set the hammer down and knelt so their eyes were level. "Because some things are worth keeping strong for as long as we can." Ella nodded solemnly, like she understood more than she should have. Rachel watched from the porch, her hands resting over her stomach. Something in her chest pulled tight and then released. Not all storms roar. Some settle into the bones, and some, by grace or chance, pass without breaking everything they touch. That night, as the stars came out and Ella slept soundly in her bed, James sat on the front step sharpening a chisel. Rachel joined him without a word, sitting beside him in the quiet. After a moment, she said, "You never told me what you want." James looked over surprised. "For yourself," she clarified. "Not for her, for you." He thought a long while, then said softly, "I want to stay somewhere that doesn't ask me to outrun who I was, just to show who I'm trying to be." Rachel looked down at her hands, the firelight dancing on her fingers. "Then maybe you already found it." He turned to her, his voice steady. "If you want me here, I'll stay. I never asked you to leave." It wasn't a confession, not quite a promise, but it was more than he'd ever had. James didn't say another word. He didn't need to. He was already home. The world had turned green again. Not just in the grass or the beanstalks or the fat leaves of the squash vines curling up the fence. No, it was deeper than that. It was in the breath that didn't hitch, in the coffee shared on the porch, in the laughter of a little girl who no longer looked over her shoulder when she smiled. It was in the way Rachel stood now, taller, softer somehow. Her arms still bore the strength of a woman who had raised a child alone, but her face had shed some of its guarded edges. The set of her jaw had eased. Her eyes no longer searched the horizon as if expecting loss to come walking up the trail. And James, he never said he had stayed. He simply never left. He didn't sleep in the granary anymore. A corner of the house had been cleared, and with Rachel's quiet nod, a bed had been built there by his own hands. The mattress was still thin, the beams uneven, but it stood firm, like him. Every morning he rose before the sun. Sometimes Rachel joined him in the garden. Her sleeves rolled her boots muddy, her hands moving beside his, like they had always been meant to. Ella followed him from barn to fence line, balancing on logs, chasing chickens, asking endless questions. She now introduced him to neighbors, not as the man from the storm, but simply, "This is James. He's ours." He heard it once, casually said, like it meant nothing, but it meant everything. On Sundays, Rachel and Ella rode into town in a two-wheeled wagon filled with loaves of fresh bread, wild herbs, and bundles of dried lavender. Rachel wore her hair down now. The townspeople had stopped whispering. They bought the bread and asked about the child's pony and whether the man who stayed ever planned to come to town with them. Rachel's reply was always the same: "He's where he belongs." James stayed behind, not because he didn't want to go, but because the farm needed tending. The roof needed patching. The bees had begun to gather near the apple tree again, because someone had to keep the world turning while the others were away. And he liked that someone being him. Mid-July brought thick heat and tall corn. The windmill turned lazily under a wide blue sky, and the well water ran cold enough to sting the back of the throat. One morning, James dug a trench from the garden to the barn to help with the drainage. By midday, he was soaked through sweat, streaking the dust on his face. Rachel walked out with a tin cup of water and a cloth for his neck. She didn't say much, just handed them over and stood beside him while he drank. After a while, she spoke. "I used to hate summers." James raised an eyebrow. "They were too loud," she said. "Everything growing and demanding and moving all at once. When he died, I wanted everything to stop. But the world didn't care." James looked down at the trench he'd dug. "Now?" he asked. She thought a moment, then shrugged. "Now I like the noise." That night, they sat on the porch after Ella had gone to bed. Rachel stitched a rip in her dress and James worked on smoothing a plank for a new storage chest. The air was thick with heat and the scent of grass and ash. The stars blinked slowly overhead. "Do you remember what you said when you came back?" Rachel asked suddenly. James paused his sanding. "I said a lot of things. You said this was the first place that made you want to stand still." He nodded. "Still true." She put down her sewing. "And if I asked you to ride out tomorrow, I'd go." She looked at him. "But I'd come back," he added. She didn't smile, but her hand reached across and touched his rough knuckles, calloused fingers, a thumb that twitched from a long-heeled break. "I'm not asking," she said softly. "I know." Silence stretched between them like something worn and comfortable. Then, from inside Ella's voice, "Mama," Rachel stood. "Comin'." She turned to James. "Don't stay out too long." "I never do." The next morning, Rachel found a wildflower tucked into the crack of the windowsill. Bright yellow, delicate, the kind of flower that shouldn't have survived the dry ridge but somehow had. She knew where it came from. Later that day, James sat beside the chicken coop carving a small fox from a block of cedar. Ella sat nearby swinging her legs and pretending to teach the pony how to count. Rachel came out a folded quilt over her arm. "It's cooling off," she said. "Come in soon." "I will." She hesitated, then stepped closer. "I was wrong," she said. "About what?" She looked toward the ridge. "I used to think some people came into your life just to leave." James set the carving down. "I'm not leaving." "I know." That night, Rachel pulled a box from under the bed. Inside were things she hadn't touched in years. His old shirt, a cracked compass, the last letter he'd written her from the field. She took out the compass and placed it on the table near James's cup. "I kept it to remind me which way was forward," she said. James picked it up gently. "Did it work?" "Not always, but I got here." They sat in silence, the kind that holds everything words cannot. From outside came the rustling of the wind through the beans, the creak of the porch step, the far-off call of an owl. James looked at Rachel. "I don't have a ring," he said. She raised an eyebrow. "You proposing?" "No," he said. "Just saying. I don't need one." She nodded. "Neither do I." She stood, turned toward the door, then paused. "But if you want to build a second bed frame," she said over her shoulder, "make it a little bigger." And then she disappeared into the house. James sat there, the compass in one hand, the half-carved fox in the other. The wind stirred. And from deep in his chest, something broke open, not in pain, but in peace. Because after everything, this wasn't a story of what had been lost. It was a story of what had stayed. Healing isn't always loud. It doesn't always come with declarations or grand endings. Sometimes it comes in silence in the hands that keep working and the feet that stay planted. James didn't ride off into legend. He stayed. And Rachel, who once thought her heart was buried forever, found that it could bloom again beside a man who never tried to erase the past, only to be part of the future. If this story touched you, please leave a comment and subscribe to Whispers of the Wild West. Because sometimes the strongest love isn't the kind that arrives, it's the kind that never leaves.